Good afternoon. I am Amy Poster. I am the Risk and Regulatory Lead for New York City-based fintech company Horizon Fintechs. We are delighted to offer you today a great webinar, Doing Well by Doing Good, the ESG intersection. I am delighted to welcome our hosts who have made all of this possible, Baker Hostetler, and the two partners. I wanted to ask Marty Booher and Chris Carolyn to welcome everybody. Marty, Chris?
Thank you very much, Amy. This is Chris Carolyn with Baker Hostetler. Before going further, let me first thank you. I came to you with this idea some months ago about organizing a webinar surrounding ESG and what's happening in the market and how it's intersecting with moves for climate change and sustainability and et cetera. And you embraced it with open arms. You helped build this panel. You've been tireless in sort of assembling everything and worrying about every detail. So thank you very, very much for all your work. We at Baker Hostetler are delighted to welcome all the participants this afternoon. Because we are a law firm and we have a general counsel, the general counsel is making sure that I let you know that the comments on this webinar are for informational purposes only. They are not legal advice. And you should, of course, contact your own lawyers if they're not us, or have us become your lawyer and get proper legal advice as the case may be. Likewise, the opinions expressed by the participants are just the personal opinions and not representing any of our employers or clients or anything else. I practice in Baker Hostetler's Debt Finance Group. It's part of our broader based business practice. We have, our firm has about 1,000 attorneys and 17 offices coast to coast. You're not here to hear all about that. I'll just suffice it to say that we are a very full service law firm. We have a bunch of awards and recognitions that we're proud of. And as far as our commercial lending group, we are very broad based. We handle all kinds of transactions from the very small to the very big on behalf of different types of borrowers, issuers, public, private, sponsor backed, private equity backed, as well as representing banks and funds and other lender participants. I'll turn it over to Marty to introduce Marty Booher and our environmental practice group.
Hey, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Amy, and thanks to everybody on the panel and for those participating on the webinar. My name is Marty Booher. I lead Baker's National Environmental Team, which consists of about 40 lawyers spread across the firm's offices. By way of background, I did start my legal career in New York City decades ago. And prior to joining Baker Hostetler in 2012 and convincing my wife that it was a great idea to move to Cleveland, I was a partner at Dewey LaBeouf. So I'm an environmental lawyer, and this will just kind of give you, I got 1 minute, so I'm going to go into it. Not long ago, I was working on financing and permitting coal-fired power plants and liquefied natural gas import terminals, right? Well, hydraulic fracturing and abundance of domestic oil and natural gas changed that game. And of course, so did technological advances in solar and wind and distributed generation, which Chris Collins is going to talk about. So perspective matters, and technology advancements can really be great disruptors to the economic status quo. And it seems we're really on another precipice here. Only this time we have public perception, generational preferences, polarized politics, short news cycles, social media, and it seems to just be accelerating that disruption. So I'm interested to hear from folks on the panel, and I just say let's be patient as we move forward to decarbonizing the planet. Back to you, Amy.
And we're eager to hear from you, Marty. You are the man of the hour. So I'm also delighted to present our three other experts panelists, beginning with Nisha Desai, who is the founder and CEO of Andab Capital. We have Max Budra, who is the director from the Alternative Investment Management Association. And last but not the least, Chris Collins, the executive director of Solar One. I just wanted to mention to everybody today that Chris is the outgoing director. He is set to retire at the end of the year. And as part of his legacy, it has been announced that the state-of-the-art environmental center is due to be open in 2024. So best of luck to you. And Nisha, please introduce yourself to our audience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Amy. And it's great to be here with the panelists representing diverse but important perspectives on ESG in the finance, investment, and energy industries. My name is Nisha Desai. I'm the founder of a New York-based investment firm called Ondav Capital, which invests in early-stage tech-enabled companies with both underrepresented founders and impact-aligned value drivers for alpha. So a strictly non-concessionary strategy. And I'm excited to speak more later about ESG and private and public markets and early stage.
Max?
Yeah, my name is Max Blidger. I'm an associate director on the markets team here at the Alternative Investment Management Association, or AIMA for short. AIMA is the global representative body for the hedge fund industry. So we have about 2,000 corporate members globally. In terms of AUM, assets under management, that's about $2 trillion, which, depending on who you ask and on the particular day, is about anywhere between 2/3 and 4/5 of the hedge fund assets in the world. So we like to think we represent the voice of the industry. And within AIMA, I work specifically on our responsible investment, or ESG, or whatever you want to call it, implementation. So helping our managers implement ESG, making sure regulators are aware of the unique characteristics of the alternative investment world, and really trying to facilitate those managers who do wish to integrate environmental and social and governance factors into their investment strategies to do so in as easy a manner as possible. And glad to be here virtually.
I do have to mention that Max is broadcasting from London. So thank you so much for taking the time. I know it's evening there. And
Yeah, my pleasure.
Chris Collins, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you for the introduction earlier. I've been at SolarOne since 2004. I was a founding ED there, and prior to that, I was an attorney. I practiced law for about 20 years in New York and California, doing mostly commercial litigation, as well as some CERCLA and RCRA litigations in California, closing some landfills out there. In 2000, I moved over to Oracle Consulting as a program director there, and then to Sapient, which is a web-based technology firm in New York, and I worked on risk mitigation activities for them before taking the job at SolarOne. And I'll get into what SolarOne does a little bit later in the program.
Thanks, Chris. Before we begin the webinar, there were just some housekeeping items I wanted to share. We want to encourage all of you to participate in our Q&A sessions by hitting and typing into your Q&A button. We also want to encourage all of you to participate in our polling questions. At the end of the webinar, we are offering CLE credits, and we are going to flash the CLE credentials that all of you could use following a survey. The webinar is about an hour with about 10 minutes for Q&A. And with that, I want to ask Max, start us off. President Biden is going to Europe. Could you provide a macro overview of the transition to net zero economy, comparing Europe and the US?
Yes, and I'll try not to take up the entire panel to do so. Just at a very high level, I think, given that this is, I'm assuming, a predominantly American audience, I think one of the most striking differences is the lack of political polarization around the issue of climate change here in Europe, right? There's a significant amount of momentum in Europe towards regulating and trying to reorient capital towards creating a quote unquote sustainable economy. And for a variety of reasons, right? So, there's not really the same kind of energy producing regions or politically important or powerful energy producing regions as you have in the United States. A lot of the regulation occurs kind of one step beyond the political process at the European Union, which is somewhat removed from the day-to-day kind of Sturm and Drang of politics. And Europeans, of course, are also slightly more comfortable with state intervention, right? I live in London, as you mentioned, which is ostensibly kind of the free market capital of Europe. But nonetheless, I still have to pay a license to own a television. So there's a bit more state intervention. In terms of what that means by way of regulation, it means that the EU is effectively trying to use capital markets as a way to restructure the European economy. So that means a sustainable finance plan that entails several things that I won't kind of bore everyone with, but effectively the lodestar of it is something called the green taxonomy, which is effectively a list of environmentally friendly economic activities. And the idea is they're going to kind of nudge private capital towards investing in those things. And that trickles down through investors into investment managers into issuers. And that's the theory. The juxtaposition with the United States is, as I'm sure I don't have to tell everyone on the call, pretty clear. I mean, obviously, now that you have a new administration, there's much more positivity around doing something on climate change. But I think, as I don't have to tell anyone on this call, there's not the same kind of political consensus around climate change in the United States or indeed in Canada that there is in Europe. So that means effectively the US is going to have to rely on executive action and action by the agencies, the regulatory agencies, to try to accomplish the same thing. Which means what you're probably going to see, instead of a kind of taxonomy and a really kind of forceful shove of regulation and capital towards sustainable economic activities, you're probably going to see things more like the SEC expanding the definition of what's a material risk to include ESG factors. And the SEC also has a consultation out, which closes this Sunday, and if you're keen on moving forward. And then the last thing I think is also worth mentioning, and it's something our members have to deal with quite a bit and probably will, is there's a fair amount of movement at the state level in the United States, right? So Illinois has a sustainable finance plan. Texas has a recent bill that would require its public pension funds to divest from investment managers that in turn divest from carbon intensive industries. So there's a lot of kind of push and pull. Obviously, investment managers are interested in ESG for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure Nisha can speak to. But I would urge everyone to keep in mind that in a lot of these circumstances, investors or investment managers are being pushed by investors who are being pushed by regulators. So long story short, this is coming no matter where you are.
And this is a question I wanted to pose both to you and Nisha. There are new SASB, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and the TCFD requirements. Do you think that your asset managers, your constituencies, and the smaller emerging managers are going to find difficulty in trying to comply with these standards? Nisha, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely, Amy. And that's correct. SASB actually took over 2 years to develop these standards in conjunction with industry practitioners, regulatory agencies, and investors. So it was a group effort, and there was consensus around it. But I think that what's important, and we actually have the SEC's support in this, because the SEC did not state in its guidance recently on ESG that any one of the industry taxonomies is the right one, which is helpful, right? Because SASB is one taxonomy. Other investors choose to focus specifically on the SDGs, and yet others on the Gen Network's IRIS framework. I do think what is helpful, though, is recognizing that these standards can be burdensome to implement for smaller funds and issuers who have smaller AUMs or investment sizes, right? And so that has to be taken into consideration. But I do think that when we are talking about billion and multi-billion dollar funds and transactions to prevent greenwashing and to introduce some standardization into evaluation by pensions, et cetera, these criteria are helpful. But certainly at the early stage fund level, we have companies that are sub $150 million that don't have GAAP financials. So it wouldn't be practical, especially in private markets, where the point is to insulate them and allow the companies to operate with frameworks that are appropriate for their investor sets and to use capital accordingly, to impose these expensive third-party criteria.
Well, that's a good point that you've made about some of the smaller managers not having gap, financials. So, Max, what's the workaround that you tell your members, if there's even any? What are you hearing from your members?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, first and foremost, we have to remember that ESG can mean many, many different things, right? Obviously, there's, as you mentioned, SASB, TCFD, but just the fact that there are probably a dozen global standards for ESG should probably tell you about the difference in views. So what most of our managers focus on, obviously being hedge fund managers, is risk management. So what we would usually recommend is, if you're a manager, you don't necessarily have to overhaul your entire strategy. It's more looking at your existing strategy and looking at which material ESG risks you're exposed to, which is something actually SASB, which has something called the materiality map, is kind of helpful in doing. So you could look at, for instance, if you were invested in commodities, you would be exposed to XYZ ESG risks. And that's where a lot of this is starting. But at the same time, you're also seeing investors expecting more reporting out of investment managers, which, to Nisha's point, can get quite complicated because in a lot of jurisdictions, most jurisdictions, in fact, issuers aren't necessarily obligated to report that data out. So investment managers can find themselves caught in the middle of investors needing this information, issuers not being required to issue that information, and also that data being, frankly, sometimes quite difficult to collect, and having to reconcile that difference. Obviously, the positive spin on this, as one responsible investment manager at a large hedge fund with whom I work quite a bit, likes to say, challenges are an opportunity for alpha. So some managers are kind of looking at this as a way of distinguishing themselves and kind of generating outperformance. I think you're still on mute.
This is a question I wanted to ask the panel, and anyone can jump in. So Larry Fink, the chairman of BlackRock, had mentioned that the ESG requirements should not only be limited to public companies, but also to private companies. And I wanted to hear everyone's view on this. Anyone? The lawyers?
Sure, Amy, I can take a crack at getting started. I look at a lot of the ESG, or at least when we talk about ESG, the core ESG as it's emerging inside the United States, certainly in the finance realm, as really being voluntary and driven by the private sector. There are going to be more mandates coming from states and maybe someday the federal government. But I think a lot of the ESG we're talking about today does arise in the context of funding agreements, at least in my world, my narrow context. And to that extent, it should be as available to private companies as public. What I would be getting into, later on when I speak further, is how some of these facilities are more carrot oriented rather than stick oriented. And I think that's somewhere at the back of your question too, is how do we make these actually not just incentives, but actual, mandates to move forward.
So I think this is a great juncture to actually bring out our polling questions. So if we could request the first polling question to be flashed on the screen. So the question is, do you see publicly traded companies being proactive in ESG adoption? Curious to hear what the audience has to say. Can we get the results? Okay. 78% of the audience is saying that the publicly traded companies are being proactive. Do any of the panelists agree or disagree before I go to Chris Collins? Any comments on this?
I think one of the things that will be really interesting to watch over the next several years and to track historically is where within a corporation the ESG focused dollar commitments are arriving from. Historically, they've been born out of the CSR budget or the foundation. And what will really be telling, and what I think that is a reasonable ask of, pensions, et cetera, to large corporates, is how much money out of the P&L of your profit generating businesses are you allocating to ESG oriented programs, right? And it's not just limited to E, and that's an important thing that I think we in the United States need to recognize. Historically, a lot of ESG had been that emerged out of Australia and Europe had been focused on E because there is less sort of social and medical stratification in those Scandinavian economies, for example. So the social issues were not as glaring. Here in the United States, especially in the last 18 months, we've seen a focus on the S as well. So looking to see across all business lines in a company if they are allocating dollars to E, S, and G programs as a part of their core businesses, and reactively around their CSR will be telling.
I think the points you're making is a great segue as we introduce Chris Collins. And I think one of the questions, so everyone hold their thought, because one of the questions I want to ask Chris later is that what are your challenges in terms of funding, and where do you think it should be coming from? So Chris, we're eager to hear about Solar One, the programs, and how it's making a difference in New York.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Solar One started back around 2004. We started initially as an environmental education organization focused on renewable technologies in New York City and energy efficiency. We developed a curriculum called the Green Design Lab, which uses a school building as a learning lab to teach about energy, food, water, and materials. Kids are in school 7 hours a day, so why not use their environment to teach about all these things while they're there? In 2010, we got some funding from the National Science Foundation and from the Rockefeller Foundation to build out a curriculum called Clean Tech, which was geared more towards high school students and focused on clean technology. Also really sort of targeting career and technical education programs in the New York City Department of Education. We've been in about a total of about 1,000 schools in New York City. I like to say that 1 in every 283 Americans is a New York City public school student. So you get an idea of the size and scope of the New York City public school system, about 1,700 schools and 1,200 school buildings. In 2010, the Obama administration had the stimulus funding for green collar job training, and a number of workforce agencies in the city that typically serve people coming out of the criminal justice system, people who are chronically unemployed, formerly homeless, veterans, went out and got stimulus money, the IRS stimulus money back in 2010, 2012, but didn't really know how to do green collar job training. So we developed a program that focuses on green building operations and maintenance, green construction, electrical and plumbing, and more recently PV solar installation. And I'll explain that a little bit more as we get into the last program. We have 3 citywide programs: our education program, our workforce training program, and then a third program that we developed over the course of the last 5 or 6 years called Here Comes Solar. And that program is really focused on affordable housing, low and moderate income housing in New York City. We have, to what Max was saying earlier, leaving it up to a lot of the state and city mandates that require the city and the state to hit certain carbon emission reduction goals. And so we're in a very fortunate position that the price of solar came down at the same time that the mandates started to come into play. And so the result is that there's a very favorable climate for development of renewables in New York City. We have a pipeline of about 500 or so buildings in our portfolio. And what we do is we've done it kind of in a unique way. We do a lot of pre-development work. So we'll work with an affordable housing developer that may have 30, 40, 50 buildings. We'll do an initial assessment of those buildings and determine that maybe 30 are viable for solar. And then we'll do a deeper dive. We'll look at the roof condition, we'll look at the energy generation, we'll look at the size of the system, what kind of financing might be available. I remember a lot of these are nonprofits that don't have the need for tax equity investments, so we figured out how to crack that nut. And then we will bundle those 30 together and send them out to bid through an RFP process to installers. And we're getting bids coming in at 15 to 20% below what they would normally cost to install in New York City. What's key to all of that is we're also able to include in our RFPs for larger projects the ability to encourage installers to hire people coming out of a workforce training program to do some of the installs. So one of our most recent projects was a very large project we did with the New York City Public Housing Authority called NYCHA. We did 40 buildings over 3 NYCHA campuses in East Harlem and in Queens. And we were able, it was a 6-month job, and we were able to hire 13 people coming out of our program. All the residents, 300 residents of those NYCHA complexes will get energy credits on their energy bill, savings on their energy bill to about $175 a year, which is a significant savings for people in public housing. So we have a really interesting suite of programs that target both education, workforce, and actual deployment of solar and renewables in affordable housing in New York City. And we're also looking at addressing the market rate housing through the development of an LLC, where we can charge a fee for the development of those market rate housing programs. I will say that there's no lack of capital, there's no lack of tax equity and developed long-term debt interested in these projects. There's still a return on investment for solar in New York City. So really for us, the challenges that you raised in your question are really a capacity question for us. If we have 12 people on staff focused just on the solar program, if we had another 100 people, we could, those 12 people are doing 20 megawatts, which is a small amount of money, a small amount of energy generated in the context of New York City itself. But if we had 10 times those number of people, we could do 10 times that. And then we're starting to make a real dent in energy and carbon reduction in New York City. So I'll pass it back to you, Amy.
So part of your mission is job training and education. Where does diversity and inclusion, and how does it play into your programs in terms of your outreach to disadvantaged members of the New York City community?
Yeah, it's a combination of things. We do a lot of work with partners. And so we work with a lot of environmental justice organizations in New York City. We work with We Act for Environmental Justice, with UPROS, with a number of organizations that are focused on making sure that the new green economy really is part of, that they're part of it. In particular, UPROS has just been working with the state on a new wind turbine manufacturing facility in Sunset Park. That's a real important piece of what we do. All of our work is targeted in communities that have historically been marginalized, and we take pride, but also really work at developing real true partnerships with a number of the community-based organizations throughout the city to help them achieve their goals. And that's really how we do it. Internally with our DEI, we have our own assessments going on to make sure that as an organization, we also walk the walk, and we are we work at that kind of all the time.
Can you just clarify for our audience what you meant by there seems to be no lack of funding, but it's really capacity? Is it, you know, you need to have a bigger budget to be able to hire more people, or we're curious to understand that dynamic?
Yeah, if we had more people on our staff, we could do more development. There isn't any lack of development for the projects themselves. There's a lot of funding available for actually doing projects in New York City. It's just putting them together. It's getting the kind of work that we do done for as many buildings as we can get done. And typically our funding comes from a combination of foundation grants and a fairly large number, more and more, of government contracts. We're doing a solar where feasible program for the Housing Preservation Department in New York City, where all of those buildings that come through HPD for loan renewal go through screening process. And if the payback on solar is 10 years or less, they're required to put solar on their properties. So it's those kinds of contracts that foundations have helped us grow and become part of the institution, become part of the bureaucracy, if you will, that will be developing these solar projects throughout New York City with government funding.
One last question I wanted to ask you is there just not enough people with the right background for you to staff up? Is that the issue?
No, the people are out there. We can find them. It's just what we need is capacity for our own organization. We need to be able to hire additional staff. And you want to hire staff for 2 or 3 years at least. You want to have funding in place to be able to hire staff for 2 or 3 years. So we want to have those long-term streams of revenue, but also long-term streams of business that we know are going to come in. And so as we build our pipeline from 500 buildings to 1,000 buildings to 1,500 to 2,000 buildings over time, that will enable us to grow our capacity internally to be able to handle that work and get that stuff out the door.
Thanks, Chris. And now we are eager to hear from our lawyers. So I wanted to begin off with Marty. Marty, I call you the man of the hour because on May 26, in what the media had described as climate rage, 3 companies, Royal Dutch Shell, Exxon, and Chevron, either through a court order or through shareholder activist actions, have prompted a lot of these 3 companies to speed up their green emissions programs. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Amy. And yeah, it has been widely reported as climate rage and rage. And I don't know. I'm not sure if it was climate rage or rage, or if it's just something else changed and timing confluences just happened to be coincidental. But really, what changed? Well, the Biden administration, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, they really have already played an important role in this process. So what would have happened to some of the proxy votes, particularly for the oil and gas companies that were directed to kind of establish targets for greenhouse gas emission reductions across the board, and it was more than 3, right? I mean, there were multiple proxy votes that succeeded for major oil and gas companies. Some of it was that the proxies actually made it to the shareholders, because under the Trump administration, more likely than not, those proxies would not have made it to the shareholders for a vote. And so you definitely had the Biden administration and the SEC under the Biden administration shifting that and putting those proxies to a vote. On the Exxon board vote, there's always going to be some form of a consistent push by many institutional investors, such as state employee funds and things like that, towards getting out of investments or pressuring traditional, what I'll say, quote, dirty industries, that's perception, to clean up their act. But I think what I saw, at least in reading some of the background materials on, what Exxon's major shareholders were talking about, I mean, they put together what I would say a pretty cogent argument as a financial argument, right? It wasn't just like and with Exxon, it was a board vote. It wasn't just like you better do this because you're destroying the environment type of initiative. It was, they had a lot of issues with the financial performance of ExxonMobil, return on investment, the CapEx strategy versus industrial peers. So, there's a lot of really smart people that are working at the hedge funds and the people that own the shares in ExxonMobil. And I just don't think that it was rage. I think it was they needed to push the board as well as the executives in the C-suite level to make some changes. So, and I guess let me shift back to some of what happened on, with Chevron and Phillips 66, ConocoPhillips, and some of these other major oil and gas companies that got the direction to establish emission targets. I mean, some of this is about how you draft up the proxy. And having, a lot of experience in dealing with industry and how public perception is as it relates to environmental and social justice issues, it's a pretty well-known fact if you ask somebody, hey, look, we really should reduce greenhouse gas emissions over a long period of time, right? And then you note some of the benefits of doing that, but then you really don't talk about the adverse consequences from a financial perspective. Or it's not detailed enough for folks to really understand what it means to them in their pocketbook. At least this is a U.S. perspective, right? They always say yes. No one's going to vote against. No one's going to say, yeah, let's not improve the environment. I think we all believe in that as kind of down to our core, and that's been the case in 20 plus years of experience for me when these issues come up. So, when that proxy is put in front of a shareholder, and let's just say a normal shareholder, like someone that owns, 1,000 shares of Chevron, they're going to vote yes, right? And then, of course, there's a lot of sophisticated people that own large chunks of shares that think that these issues are very important and think it's in the best interest of these companies to start thinking about what's next, right? So I guess the last thing that I haven't necessarily addressed yet is the Shell decision. And so I'm a U.S. lawyer, and it's always great to see how to, read different decisions, right? And so this was from one judge in a Dutch district court, right? and boy, I will say this, he has a lot of guts, and it's amazing at how much power one judge can hold. But what I'd say is, to be fair, and as you're looking at this, and to be fair to the judge, one, there's going to be an appeal, and that appeal will be de novo, and that's going to take a couple of years. And, and so this judge kind of looked at the facts, and he made the decision he thought he needed to make. But also, one of the things when you get into the details, the judge did make a distinction, and we all need to kind of be aware of that, between what Shell must do, right? Which is, what he called the results obligation. And what he said is you need to reduce your direct greenhouse gas emissions, right? And then what Shell needs to do with respect to kind of what I'll say it's emissions from its suppliers, so people providing it with electricity, service providers, and also emissions from the downstream users related to the products, Shell's products. So there he suggested that they need to do significant best efforts to do, right? And that's a little bit different. And it's definitely a different standard than must. And so we'll have to see how it plays out. It'll be interesting to see what really happens with Shell and what the next court talks about on these issues, because we're going to have 2 to 3 years of more ESG push, right? And more kind of what I'll say public perception changes. The United States is certainly moving in that direction. So hopefully, Amy, that answers your questions for now.
Well, one question that comes to my mind, and I'd like to hear the European perspective from Max. Do you think that it's actually really the shareholders versus governments that are going to push for ESG compliance? So you've kind of, given us an overview, but I'd like to compare and contrast Europe versus US. So you want to start off, Marty, and then I'd be curious to ask Max.
Oh yeah, sure. And I think I would have answered this question differently, 10 months ago, right? But I do think that there's going to be a role for shareholders in pushing the ESG kind of movement in the United States. But I really do think and I agree with Max, he was spot on in my view. The Biden administration is going to push this, and it's going to be a government push, and they're going to lead the charge. There's no question about it. And the Securities Exchange Commission, they're already starting this initiative. They're gonna adopt rules. They're gonna change policies, and it relates to both climate change, but also kind of your more general environmental, social, and governance policies. It's not a question of if; it's a question of when. And environmental justice in this administration is extremely important. And that is going to drive a lot of what you're going to be seeing coming out of the SEC in terms of ESG guidelines. And my advice to clients is, and publicly traded clients is, it's time to start getting ahead of these issues and be involved in that whole regulatory development to make sure it's going to fit, as opposed to trailing behind them and reacting to them. So from there, I'll turn it over to Max, I think.
Yeah, Max, are European shareholders any different than the American shareholders?
No, I think Marty was exactly right. One of the kind of biggest things you have to wrap your head around, and one of the things I think that's really driven the adoption of ESG and the kind of groundswell of support for it in the past 2 years, is there's been increasing recognition that we're talking, for the most part, and I know there are kind of impact strategies, but when we talk about ESG, we're effectively talking about financially material risks, right? So if you think climate change is a financially material risk, you have a financial interest in pushing a company to take that into account. So this isn't necessarily about rage. It's not necessarily about wanting to even have a positive environmental impact outside of, obviously that's important, but at the end of the day, a lot of this is just risk management. So this is investment managers saying, we are invested in this large company, even though these risks, the physical risks, are potentially long-term. One of the things that makes this space so interesting is we don't actually know when the risk realization event will happen. So we don't know when those long-term physical risks are suddenly going to be translated into market volatility, right? If everyone suddenly took climate change very, very seriously tomorrow, that would have massive financial implications across the economy. So managers are aware of this, and they're trying to mitigate their exposure to unwanted ESG risks, as they would most other risks if they're active risk managers.
I want to turn over the floor to Chris Carolyn. Chris focuses in debt finance. So on a macro level, I wanted to ask Chris, what sort of trends are you seeing, especially in the loan sector, in terms of ESG compliance?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Amy. And just for everyone who's going to see slides and whatnot, listening at home or in your office, Marty and I put together a lot of slides for the basis of your CLE material. I'm certainly not going to be able to get through mine now. I'm going to try to keep this at a high overview and give you some granular thoughts that tie into what everyone has said. So to Jill, who's gainfully managing the slides, don't worry about trying to flash through mine, but everybody will get these after the webinar. So we've heard through the most of this webinar about the demand, the evolution, the need for capital to back up companies with these increasingly ambitious ESG goals. And the debt capital markets have been evolving alongside the general overall appetite and need since the first green bond was issued around 2007. And as things stand now, and this is changing on it seems like the pace of change is getting more rapid every week. There's at least 3 different types of loan or debt products to think about at a very high level. And they each tracked one of the E, the S, and the G. The original product was the green bond, which is a project bond and probably still the best known mode of financing. The green bond was a type of project finance that supported the development or construction or refurbishment of a plant or some other sort of infrastructure, turning it towards some green power project or renewable energy project, sustainability, things of that nature. the green bond had a lot of advantages, but it was designed primarily for large companies that could afford, these are public bonds, so they could afford a public offering, and they had the infrastructure to support the rigorous public reporting requirements that come from that. For private companies, things like that are not as useful, because if you're a private company, you're not otherwise needing to match the SEC public reporting requirements that public companies are subject to. But if you take a publicly traded bond, you can opt into that. There also was a lot of transaction cost involved with closing one of those. And as I mentioned, the additional reporting requirements can put a burden on smaller companies. So the green bond was not quite enough for your smaller, more middle market or your private company that nonetheless wanted to embrace and build green projects. So the green loan evolved some years after the first green bond, and the green loan was just, as I've already described it, it's a product that is more of a loan rather than a bond. Realistically, what that means is the lender has a bit more control, a bit more accountability built into the loan documents than you might have in a bond, because the green loan can include covenants, whereas the green bond would have goals written into its offering memorandum that were not necessarily reflected in the indenture. And so if the quote unquote green project fell short of its green goals in its offering memorandum, there wasn't always accountability or a way for the investors or the note holders to take account to that project. The green loan addressed that problem by the ability of loan documents to be very bespoke. They start with common forms, but then become very much more focused on the individual borrower and individual group of lenders. And so there's covenants in there that allow that accountability. But backing both the green loan and the green bond are a set of principles that identify the green loan principles, the green bond principles, which create sort of an identity or a fingerprint about how these financing structures are identified. For companies that are looking to make progress on ESG goals, but are not necessarily constructing a bespoke green project, the so-called SLL loans have emerged. Those are, that awkward acronym is sustainability linked loans. And unlike the green bond or the green loan, they allow a lot more broader set of objectives and can finance and incentivize a borrower to finance improvements to their practice, to their to the way they operate their business, to become greener, more sustainable. It can still be used for construction of like a green project finance type initiative, but can also be used to do things like reduce the carbon footprint of their manufacturing, find a cleaner way to distribute their energy, make the facilities for the workers safer. And even we have not talked much about the social part, although Nisha tried to bring it up, the social part of the ESG, but also to even embrace some diversity and inclusion targets among the workforce and workplace experience. And Max had mentioned that as well. One difference between the US and Europe and maybe Australia was that in the US, there might be more of an appetite and more of a leverage point for the S and the G part of ESG. And I think that's true. I think, Amy, just rounding back to your question, I think that's one of the points where the ESG finance market in the United States is going to continue to evolve as lenders and borrowers find more creative ways to leverage these loan structures to accomplish tangible targets with workplace, with social issues, and not least of all with environmental and sustainability at the forefront.
So one burning question I wanted to ask you is that what types of sustainability metrics are being measured by issuers versus banks, and what is the impact for, let's say, issuers if they do not meet these ESG standards?
Yeah, that is the question of the moment as well. I think it's safe to say one thing that differentiates, and maybe Max can tell me if I'm right or wrong, one thing that differentiates US, if not North American ESG loans from the European variety is that we're a lot more carrot than we are stick at present. What you get in the United States might be, you know, a half a basis point, or I'm just sort of using that as a round number, but you get a break on your interest rate if you reach certain verified, externally verified metrics that you'll negotiate for inside your loan agreement. Some of these are now publicly available because there's been a number of these that have closed in the last couple of months with public companies. So you can Google those, Edgar those, and find out what those different metrics look like. But they get to, you know, reducing carbon footprint or XYZ, what other, you know, beneficial goal you're supposed to set out over the course of your loan term. But there's often not any repercussion if the borrower fails to hit those targets. They'll just stick with the same old pricing they currently have. And in a low interest rate environment, particularly if you're an investment grade borrower, the difference between your interest rate at closing and your interest rate once you achieve your ESG goals may not be that dramatic, all other things considered. I do know that there is more of an effort to create other incentives inside loan agreements in the United States, mimicking some of what's already been practiced in Europe, and creating actual covenants that require businesses to hit certain targets. I think particularly, and I think this is the real opportunity, particularly for companies that are trying to do sort of a light green improvement to existing practices or structures. I think for them to get an ESG loan, it may be necessary to put more than the carrot in their loan agreement and actually have some sort of mandate to get that accomplished.
So I am curious to ask that same question to Nisha, but before I turn it over to Nisha, I wanted to call on the third polling question. Can we have that flash on the screen, please? So what sectors within ESG strategy are attracting investor interest? And I'm sure Nisha has a lot to comment on this. Let's see what the results are. Can we see the results? Wow, it's energy. Is anyone surprised? Any quick comments? Chris Collins, are you surprised?
I'm actually not surprised, mostly because, you know, energy is what we have. You can't live without it, right? It's what we have. We have to use it all the time, in every aspect, and it is a function of our lives. So I can see why that would attract attention, and because there's money to be made on it. I think there is the carrot there. It's real money that can be made, and there's subsidies, there's incentive programs at the state level across the country. Various states have incentive programs. There's tax credits at the federal level. There's all sorts of stuff to make energy work, renewable energy work at least. Amy, I think you're on mute.
Nisha, we're excited to hear from you. I think my first question is that what are the typical misconceptions about impact or ESG investing?
Yeah, I think we've touched on a couple, but just to confirm, I think the number one is that it's purely values-based, judgment-oriented, and for below market rate returns. And there's really three flavors of impact or sustainable finance that have evolved, right? The first has been negative screening, so screening out investments, and that is applied to many energy companies, nuclear, weapons, coal mining, et cetera. The second that evolved was sort of stakeholder oriented. Is this helping causes that we care about? And that could be indirectly through a company's CSR program or through creating jobs in certain geographies. And the third flavor, which is more recent, is does the core function of the company align to sort of impact metrics, right? Have we materially aligned the P&L, the profit margins, the success, the compensation of the CEO and the entire business model to alleviating issues that are the core of ESG. And that's what we focus on at Ondav Capital. And it means that we do have slightly more constrained universe of investment opportunities, but it also means that we think we're hedged for the long term. And this can also be applied in public equities portfolios as well. And it gets back to whether investment managers and issuers are operating with the stick or the carrot mindset. And there are, limited partners and long-term investors for each. They're both very different paradigms. So that would be the first, that ESG means that you are not achieving alpha. I think in the hedge fund world and in my world, in early stage VC, it was hard to sell limited partners on that 2 or 3 years ago. And now folks are picking up on that, and they're echoing that. But still, in the minds of investors, they usually think, okay, I have a for-profit oriented pocket and I have a social impact pocket. Which one are you asking me to draw out of? And that's not a very sort of forward-thinking mindset when we think about long-term goals. To Max's view, that a lot of this is about risk reduction and alignment of incentives for the management team and long-term decision-making focused on risk reduction for investors. The other one is, of course, that ESG is solely the focus of oil and gas and energy companies and an environmental consideration. And I would actually group many of the congressional testimonies that we've seen with respect to the technology companies about whether they are honoring users' privacy rights and whether they are protecting, democratic elections in various countries into the S. And I think that will be increasingly material going forward, and but at both the shareholder vote level, but also pressure for government. So don't dismiss that when you do see technology companies that are included in ESG public indices and ETFs, because those could be at risk if they don't honor some of these social areas. And the last would be that a tailored approach has to be used for both the public and private markets, depending on the fund size and really the understanding with investors, right? I appreciate Larry Fink's sentiment that private companies, should be required to disclose ESG factors, but that's really private companies of certain size that are making certain claims, potentially around carbon emissions and some of the negative screening factors. But for him to suggest potentially that, early stage companies that are focused on maternal health care need to figure out what their carbon emissions is, it's really not fit for purpose.
Do you think, and Chris Carolyn had sort of touched on this, do you think that there is a price differentiation between issuers who are much more ESG focused than those that are not? And is that a consideration in terms of investors investing in these types of companies? What are you seeing?
So, well, I can tell you in the private markets, right, and private equity, and certainly growth stage and early stage at VC, when we're dealing more with equity priced rounds, the question really comes up among limited partners, right? And you have two different demographics. You have the family offices and the H&Ws, and then you have the institutional allocators. And it's more recently that the institutional allocators to private equity funds have been asking what those private equity funds are doing about all ESG factors. And that includes DEI at the fund investor level, but also data from their portfolio companies. Now, in the private sort of individual and high net worth individual family office, there's certainly a lot of discussion about this among next gen members of these family offices. Many of them don't yet have the roles within their families to make allocations to impact-oriented or ESG investment strategies. So, you know, there are a lot of conferences had with these demographics, but I don't see material amounts of investment dollars. And this is actually a really critical point, because when we talk about emerging managers, you know, such as myself, who are leading these new strategies and who've been at the forefront of ESG investment strategies and DEI strategies for years now, the capital sources are coming from family offices and H&Ws, not institutional allocators, right? So until you know, institutional allocators are able to invest in smaller funds and have emerging manager programs that are fit for these strategies, I don't think we'll see a lot of dollars going towards ESG oriented or DEI strategies. I think you're still.
We are running out of time, so we have room for one question. And this question, I am going to ask each and one of you to please give your view before we end the webinar. So the question is, do you believe that the powerful lobbying groups, oil, gas, technology, will have an impact in delaying the Biden administration's focus to net zero economy? I'm going to start off with you, Marty.
Well, I guess it depends upon what the Biden administration does, right? And I don't mean to answer the question with a question, but I'm a lawyer, so what do you expect? No, but I mean, the reality is yeah, I think there is going to be a right sizing of enthusiasm, I guess is how I would characterize it. So I think the industry, like say, for example, many industries, it's not just oil and gas, there's steel, there's other industries, they're ready to take the next step, okay? And they already have started to take the next step. And a lot of these ESG considerations are already baked into their businesses and the way they operate, right? So I think it's just going to depend upon, and how much lobbying they do is going to depend upon how far the administration is going to push them to a point where they have a fundamental disagreement on, like, say, for example, what is the social cost of carbon? Like, where they set that price is going to really dictate how hard industry generally is going to fight. So I'll leave it at that.
Max, your comment?
It's a big question. I would say, not to be evade the question, but in a way, I don't think it really matters. I mean, capital markets care about this. Investors care about it. Some of the largest investors in the world care about it. You have things coming out of the G20, like the Investor Leadership Network. You have the Net Zero Asset Manager, Net Zero Asset Owner Alliances. This isn't going anywhere, even if the regulations are stalled. And I think a lot of issuers, to the point that's already been made, are starting to recognize that if they want to attract capital, they're going to have to at least be seen to do something about these issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, Amy, you know, I think that we can always look at Dodd-Frank as something that was constructed with a lot of energy and, you know, a lot of social input as well. It had really good tenets that serve the capital markets, but there were problematic parts that cost firms a lot and actually ended up having an adverse impact to what was the intent of the regulation, right? Banks exited certain parts of the markets that then became underserved as a result of the heavy regulation. And so with that, my only, you know, view is that it has to be a two-way discussion with sensible regulation, because it's not going to be helpful to either side to then monitor unfit regulation and then lobby to unwind them over the next decade.
And we'd love to hear from the two Chris's, Chris Collins, and let's end with Chris Carolyn.
Yeah, I sort of think it's going to be gradual, and that's unfortunate because I think time is running out. But I look to where we were 20 years ago, and this wasn't even on the table. And there's already been a lot of strides made. So I look at it as kind of a gradual progress that we'll make. We'll push a little bit further. We'll push the agenda a little bit further, but ultimately, I don't think it's any gigantic, huge swings, but it'll move slowly.
And Chris Carolyn.
Yeah, going last, I certainly don't have a lot or anything to disagree with everyone who's spoken so far in this question. I think though the only perspective I'd add to it is that we're not talking about a monolith here. I think that more and more different corporations advised by different boards and with different shareholder groups and different investors are going to be influenced more by those constituencies. So you might start to see some larger companies take a, dare I say, more progressive stance on an ESG or sustainability or climate remediation plan. And whereas you'll see others, as is going on in Texas, will try to lobby to ensure that the Texas pension funds don't invest in companies that divest from carbon. So I think what's interesting is that this is all fragmenting now. And going back to what I said during my remarks, there's a lot of change happening, and the products from the equities through the loans that are trying to incentivize and leverage and respond to this are multiplying by the day. The LSTA just released a social loan principles last week, which there's no time to go into, but maybe that'll be a topic for another webinar. But those are going to
podcasts.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a very exciting time to be talking about this, and I'll turn it back to you for closing thoughts.
Great. Before we end this webinar, I just wanted to announce the CLE credits. It's Baker 1 and Baker 2. And we also wanted to flash our contact information for those of you who are interested in contacting us. And with that, I also wanted to mention this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Baker website soon. So watch out for it. And with that, I wanted to thank our wonderful panelists. We had a great discussion, and we want to thank all of you for staying with us. I know it's near cocktail hour. And with that, we want to say goodbye and stay safe. Thank you very much.